Hello.
Hi.
So thank you for joining me today. We are going to be talking about new and revised Maryland Realtors forms, and I have with me the Director of Legal Affairs, Kathleen D'Artez.
Hi. Thanks.
Hello.
Thanks for inviting me, Colette.
You're welcome. So let's go ahead and get started. Just so you all know, the forms are now posted on Maryland Realtors website. On the statewide forms page, there's also a summary of changes and practice tips, which will give you some additional details about some of the changes and some suggestions and guidance on you just being aware of the changes and making sure that you know what they mean. So with that being said, we'll start with the new forms and then we'll jump into revisions to existing forms. The good news is that there's only one new form, which I have up here right now, the 1031 Tax Deferred Exchange Addendum. And so for those of you who do these kinds of deals regularly, you'll be familiar with the language. This is a standalone addendum. I know some of the versions of this that I've seen are embodied in an addendum of clauses, for example, but this is a standalone form and it's pretty straightforward. In paragraph 1, the parties agree to conduct the transaction via 1031, so they're agreeing to cooperate essentially and do the transaction this way. If the buyer is the exchanger, paragraph 2, that the seller agrees to cooperate and both parties are acknowledging that there won't be any additional expenses or delays. And similarly, if the seller is the exchanger, then the buyer agrees to cooperate and there's the acknowledgement that there won't be any additional delays or expenses incurred. Anything you want to add to that, Kathleen?
Just one sort of minor point is in the contract in general, it says that the contract is not assignable. With the 1031 exchange, there has to be an assignment. It doesn't go directly from the seller to the buyer. It has to be a transfer to the qualified intermediary or to transfer from the qualified intermediary. So one of the things that's in here is the other party is consenting to the contract being assigned. So that's seems like a small matter, but it's important because generally that's not part of the contract.
That's right. That's right. All right, so that's good guidance. So let's go ahead and talk about changes to the existing forms. So we'll talk about changes to the contract. And just so you know, when it's applicable, we make a change to the residential contract of sale, for example, then we'll make a change to the unimproved land contract of sale. We won't discuss that here just for purposes of time, but let me jump into changes to the contract of sale. So you'll see here the two paragraphs, the first two changes I'll discuss. One is to the adjustments provision. And the good news is that there's not really any substantive change there. Essentially, the Statewide Forms Committee elected to bold that last sentence. So it basically says, any heating or fuel remaining in the tanks at the time of settlement will become the property of the buyer. There have been situations where the agreement that the seller has with the fuel provider is a little bit different than what the contract of sale says, and issues have been arising at the settlement table. So the committee felt it important to bold this language, really just to alert the seller to be aware and to do whatever negotiation needs to be done prior to the time they get to settlement. So anything you want to add to that, Kathleen?
Yeah, again, maybe just one little practical matter, because we do still get questions on the legal hotline about this, even though, as Colette had said, the language has been there for quite some time. I would just say maybe if you're the listing agent, you probably want to make sure that you review this paragraph with your contract, especially if they have a propane tank or whatever, to make sure that they understand that whatever's in the tank is going to go to the buyer. Especially this time of year, it's starting to get colder. People might be refilling their tank. If the seller is going to spend a couple $1,000s doing that, then the day before settlement, they're going to realize, like, wait a minute, I just paid $2,000 and it's all buyer. So make sure you have this conversation with your seller. They might not want to fill the tank all the way. They might want to only partially fill it. Or even, again, just a practical matter, they can negotiate that with the buyer. If the seller did fill it all the way up and spent a lot of money doing that, they could negotiate that with the buyer and see if the buyer would be willing to prorate it or split the cost or something along those lines. So again, as Colette had said, this is the kind of thing you don't want to deal with at the day of settlement or at the table. So if you get a chance to work this out in advance, definitely a good idea to do so.
That's right. So good guidance there. Again, thanks, Kathleen.
Sure.
So we'll go on and jump down to the next provision there, and that is settlement costs. So again, this is not anything new. This last sentence that's highlighted here, buyer is a veteran buyer, then buyer broker can't charge a flat fee to buyer or seller per VA reg. So really the committee is trying to clarify the language a little bit more. You'll see in the summary of changes and practice tips a couple of links. One is to that regulation that's cited there, and the other is to the VA handbook. I included that information there to give you a little bit of a understanding of the rationale that the statewide forms committee had in terms of putting this language into the contract. So anything you want to add to that?
Not a word.
All right, so with that being said, let's go on and take a look at this last change here to the contract of sale, and that would be with regard to paragraph 60, and that is on page 10 of the contract. It's a notice. It functions as a notice to the buyer and seller about their ability to conduct the transaction electronically. So we get a lot of questions about that. Do the buyer and seller have to enter into a separate agreement to conduct the transaction electronically? Our position has been that they do not, based on how we are reading the commercial law article, which is cited there, section 21-101, basically says the parties through their actions can conduct the transaction electronically. They don't need to have a separate agreement to be able to do that. So anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's
all right. All right, great. So with that being said, I'll go on to, like I said, when it's applicable, so changes were made to the unimproved contract of sale as well. Paragraph 60 was added, and whenever it's applicable. So we'll go on and talk about some of the other changes. I'll jump in now to talk about a change to the change in terms addendum. So let me just go ahead and pull that up. Can you see that okay, Kathleen?
I can. It's a beautiful form. You know, that's one.
So we like this form, as you can see, and one of the reasons is we always have concerns about our members engaging in the unauthorized practice of law, and so whenever we can come up with a mechanism so that that doesn't have to happen, then we're likely to do that. So the change in terms addendum, essentially, the deal is the parties have already entered into the contract of sale, and now maybe the buyer wants to change the purchase price or the settlement date or one of those kinds of requests. And this form is intended to facilitate those kinds of changes. The committee incorporated some of the more common types of requests. And so this form was initially introduced last year, October 1, 2019. And the committee made some updates to it. The first one is to the financing contingency. So you'll see, and these again are relatively minor kind of tweaks. You'll see the new paragraph 3 is now titled written application for financing. And the idea here is that this language tracks the language in paragraph 10 of Maryland Realtors residential contract of sale. So the buyer in that provision has a certain amount of time to apply for financing. They also have a certain amount of time by agreement to obtain the written financing commitment. And so the change here is essentially, changing the time frame for applying for financing so it tracks the provision in the contract, and changing the time for obtaining the written financing commitment, which again tracks the language in the contract. And then there's the addition of new paragraph, it would be new paragraph 5, seller contribution. That often is changed, and so it's fairly straightforward. It could be changed from X to Y. So those are the changes to the change in terms addendum.
Change in terms
I was thinking of something else. These are the changes to the change in terms addendum. Anything you want to add to that?
My favorite. I'm sorry, I'm talking over you now.
Oh, that's right.
is my favorite form, or one of my favorite forms. I sound like such a nerd, but it kind of is. It's a really useful form. It helps you guys avoid the unauthorized practice of law. You don't have to draft a completely new addendum just to change a settlement date or just to change a, the seller contribution. It's right here for you. Keep yourself out of hot water and get everything done in a more streamlined fashion. So I would just suggest to everybody, if you don't know this form or haven't used this form, definitely it's one you want to utilize. And it really is my favorite form.
All right. Yeah, it is. It's a good form. All right. So let's go on to talk a little bit about the change to the property inspections notice. So always want to make it clear when we're talking about this form, the difference between the property inspections notice and the property inspections addendum. So Maryland Realtors Property Inspections Addendum lays out the potential inspections that the parties can agree to. It spells out the rights and responsibilities of the parties with regard to the inspections. When does the buyer submit the inspection report to the seller, along with the repair request and the other requirements and so forth are outlined there. The time frames are outlined there. So basically, this update to the property inspections notice, which is essentially intended to facilitate the parties' rights and obligations under the property inspections addendum, simply alerts the parties that if they forgot about time frame for notices or any types of actions that they need to take, then they can simply refer back to the property inspections addendum. So anything you want to add to that, Kathleen?
No, just to sort of piggyback on what you had said, this is intended to work with the addendum. All those timeframes are set forth clearly in the addendum. And if you're not familiar with those or can't remember those off the top of your head, just go back and look at it, read it carefully. And for every transaction, obviously, you want to be mindful of those deadlines to make sure you don't inadvertently wait too long, or to see what happens if the other party waits too long and they haven't taken any action. What does that mean for your client? So it's a good idea to take another look at that and read that again if you haven't read it carefully in a while.
All right, great. Always good guidance that you give. So let's go on to talk about the change to the escrow agreement. So let me pull that up. All right. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
All right. So we know that, well, I should say the escrow agreement between the buyer, seller, and escrow agent, I believe initially we brought this or introduced this form back in October 2018. 2019, there was a change to the law, which basically says that if the buyer and seller agree in the contract of sale that they're going to have somebody other than a third party, other than the licensed brokers involved in the transaction, handle the deposit, then they must, and that is buyer, seller, and escrow agent, must enter into an escrow agreement. Now, this agreement, which was prepared in conjunction with the Maryland Land Title Association, does comply with the requirements of the statute. So that's good to know. And this update is essentially to paragraph 7. So paragraph 7 is titled Disputes and deals with the options that the escrow agent has if there is a dispute over the deposit. You'll be familiar with this for those of you who do the 30-day letter. The update is the inclusion of the escrow agent being able to do the 30-day letter. The language is almost word for word taken from the Brokerage Act and the statute there with regard to handling the deposit. And so essentially, if there is a dispute, the escrow agent has the ability to send out the 30-day letter to the parties, indicating who they believe should get the earnest money deposit based on what the contract says, what happened, and what the law says. And if the parties don't submit a written protest within the time frame spelled out there, then the escrow agent can go ahead and disperse the deposit. So anything you want to add to that?
Actually, just to add a little teeny bit to what you had said, this is going to be used if someone other than the broker is holding the money. If the broker is holding the EMD, they've always had that, the option to do the 30-day letter if they choose. Just if you are listening to this, if you're not familiar with that 30-day letter, we do have a sample available. That's something else that Colette had worked on previously. We have a sample policy and procedure manual for brokers, and it does include a sample 30-day letter. So if you're thinking like, wow, this sounds like a great idea, there's a sample letter that you can use, and it's on page 3, I think, in the sample.
That's right. All right. So that being said, let's turn now to look at some of the changes. So we have some very minor changes to the brokerage form. So let me just discuss those really briefly. You can jump in, Kathleen, and share some guidance and insights there. All right. So with the exclusive right to sell, back in, I want to say maybe a couple of years ago, the committee introduced this home security systems that record audio provision. And you did a great article on nanny cameras that appeared in Maryland Realtors magazine, talking about the requirements in those situations where the seller has a surveillance system that records audio. The penalties we discussed and you discussed in the article are pretty significant. And so we incorporated, or the committee, I should say, incorporated into this provision the statutory reference to that article that's in the Maryland Code of Ethics discussing penalties for violating the law. So that's really the only change there. Did you want to add to that?
I just would point out, this isn't a change, but I just would point out that there is a space there for the sellers to initial.
Right.
And encourage listing agents to make sure that they do have the sellers initial that. I think we all know that even if you tell the sellers that they're not supposed to do audio recordings, the fact of it is that technology has improved and it's really easy for people to do audio recordings, and
Right.
a lot of people just have that set up in their home already. That really is not permissible, believe it or not. So there could be consequences. I would just suggest, as a good risk management tool, that you have them initial that. You can't always control what they're going to do. You might tell them they're not supposed to do it. They might do it anyway, but at least you've got something documented saying that, you know, I did give you and inform you that you shouldn't be doing that. God forbid something happens. We hope it doesn't. But if it does, you've at least got something in writing showing that you explained that to your seller and told them it was not permissible. So
That's right. All right, well, that's good. All right, so let's go on to the next change, and that would be to paragraph 21. So that's the offers provision, and there's new language there under presentation of offers, right? So essentially and this really just tracks the language that's already in the Brokers Act, already in the Maryland Code of Ethics. If the broker must present to seller, right, all offers and counter offers, essentially, unless otherwise specified in the brokerage agreement. So pull that language from the statute, bring it into the listing agreement. Nothing new in terms of your requirements. You're always obligated to present all offers and counter offers. The statute says unless otherwise specified in the brokerage agreement. So if the seller wants to put any direction or give you any direction, put any conditions around you submitting offers or counter offers, you want to get that in writing, and you want to make it part of the listing agreement, so you've got a record of that direction. So anything you want to add to that?
Nope. I would just say, the only thing I would say is, if you have a telephone call with your seller and they give you that kind of direction, our other best friend, Colette, the confirmatory email.
Oh, yes.
I suggest if it's a phone call you have with your client, they say don't send any offers over. I would strongly suggest and encourage you guys to do a confirmatory email to your client, again, just confirming that that's the instruction and direction that they gave you. That way you've got that documented as well.
Yes, we are of the mind to always recommend, whenever possible, if the need arises, to have a record of the conversation that you can refer back to at a later date as a way of minimizing risk. So thank you for that. Confirmatory email suggested. And then finally, change to, and this is really just a minor change to the exclusive buyer-tenant residential brokerage agreement. As you all know, back in 2016, there were some substantive changes to agency law. One of them was getting rid of presumed buyer agency. There were updates to agency disclosure at open houses. And of course, we all know now that if you want to represent a buyer, you have to enter into a written buyer brokerage agreement with the buyer. So in line with those changes to agency law, and as you all, for those of you who've taken the new agency course, we know it's called brokerage relationships. So in that vein, the Statewide Forms Committee felt it important to just make sure that we were aligning our agreements and our content with what the Brokers Act says. So change the title of the form, the brokerage form, it's now the exclusive buyer-tenant residential brokerage agreement. So that's the only change there. Anything you want to add to that, Kathleen?
What can I add to that? That's perfect.
All right, so that really concludes our discussion of updates to the forms. As I've indicated, they are on the website at this point. The summary of changes and practice tips goes into a little bit more detail. And if anybody has any questions, please do reach out to us via the legal hotline. Kathleen, we have the sort of the COVID-19 hours. What are they for the hotline?
We'll answer phones. It's Mondays and Wednesdays from 10
Right.
to 4. Anytime outside of that, if you're the kind of person who wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, oh my God, I have this question. I usually say call Colette, but I don't know. You could go to our website, mdrealtor.org, and you can submit your question online and then go back to sleep. So we're always available to answer your questions.
All right. So thank you very much. I love the format, the conversational tone, and we'll be back. So thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care, guys.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.